Well, greetings and welcome to this Halloween episode of The Hidden Library. Happy Halloween, blessed Samhain, and I hope you are having a wonderful holiday. This is definitely one of my favorite holidays. So, in this episode, I am going to ask the question, what was your first scare as a child? Meaning, what was that story or movie or television show that maybe made you jump a little and perhaps question things after you turned out the lights for that evening? For me, I would say the most memorable incident that stayed with me for quite some time occurred when I was 7 years old, when my family had moved to a new neighborhood at the time. And we were actually playing with a couple neighborhood kids, and as well as some older kids that would who would later on go on to babysit my sisters and I for a time while we lived there. And I'm just sitting, we're all up on this hill in front of who would be my babysitter's house. And I'm just sitting there. Remember, I am 7 years old at the time, and it's about dusk, and we're just all kind of hanging out on this hill that slopes down. The house was up on a hill, and there was like a little bit of a slope, and that's where we were sitting on. And I was just kind of looking out into the forthcoming sunset, and I hear this voice behind me. I hear this voice behind me. Basically, I can't even begin to try to imitate how she said it, but she's just basically like, "Hello, little girl," in kind of a very high, witchy voice. And when I turned around, I jumped, okay, at what I saw. Now, what was it that I saw? Well, those of us who are 80s and 90s babies probably can recall much of our childhood being spent reading the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark Trilogy, or having it read to us perhaps by an older sibling or babysitter. Well, my babysitter apparently thought it would be funny to scare me with in the book there is this story called The Haunted House, and there is this very, very, really, the sketches in those books, the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark trilogies, done by Stephen Gammell, are absolutely just brilliant, and they really do bring the stories to life. And the story in question that my babysitter had it open to was The Haunted House. And the illustration, for those of you that recall the book, the illustration for The Haunted House, of course, is a picture of this woman in pretty much a state of decay. And and so my babysitter thought it would be funny to hold the book up to her face and sneak up behind me. And so when I turned around, I pretty much jumped out of my skin upon seeing it. So totally true story. My babysitter thought it would be hilarious to do that. And yeah, it's actually from the very first book in the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark trilogy. There's 3 books in that series. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones. And after my 7-year-old self jumped about 6 feet in the air, I did become very intrigued with the book. especially as my babysitter, she began to read some of the stories out loud. And from that point on, I actually wanted her to bring the book all the time. And when the second and third books came out, I mean, oh, you better believe I was all over those. So that seemingly passé evening from my childhood actually would go on to have more of an impact on me than I think I even knew at that moment. And this was also and this was also done for me too. I mean, it wasn't just the Scary Stories trilogy that started to intrigue me and lead me to stories of the unknown and folklore and just urban legends and myths. At the time, I was also very much intrigued by Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In fact, we were reading it at school later that Halloween, and that also pretty much sealed my interest there. But from that point on, I was a fan of dark fiction and horror, yes, even as a child. And the Scary Stories series would also be among those works that would go on to shape how I write my own stories and how I approach the certain subjects that I write about. And yes, I very much thank my babysitter, Alvin Schwartz, who was the genius behind putting together these stories that are so steeped in folklore and just brilliantly putting them together. And of course, Stephen Gammell, who's like I said, his illustrations just really brought those stories new life. Well, with that all said, I guess I also can pose the question and proceed to answer it of what it really was that intrigued not only myself, but perhaps maybe others who grew up with these books. And even as adults, many of us 80s and 90s babies still love them and are sometimes still freaked out by Stephen Gammell's illustrations. And I know I mentioned earlier the illustration for The Haunted House, but for me, it's also a couple others. The illustration for The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. For whatever reason, that illustration just is very, very offsetting to me. And then there's the illustration of from the story The Thing, or The Wraith, as some people refer to it, but in the book it's The Thing. That particular drawing still really, really freaks me out. If you don't know what I'm talking about and are feeling brave, Google Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, The Thing, and you will see what I am talking about. Yeah, that drawing, it's like it's staring right into your soul. It's pretty, pretty, like I said, just that there's just something not right about that. But to be honest, getting back to what I was saying, I really can't pinpoint one specific reason as to why those stories stay with me even to this day. Several things about these books continue to intrigue and influence my own writing as well, as I said earlier. One aspect is the illustrations. I cannot praise Stephen Gammell enough for his illustrations. I mean, come on. Even the stories that weren't really that scary were given very gruesome visuals that made them probably even more frightening than they really were. And Gammell's drawings are so wonderfully macabre and detailed that to me, I think that one can almost feel the terror and unease being experienced by those in the story. And another reason why these stories have stayed with me and were such an influence on me for so long is honestly the pure simplicity of the stories. In fact, most of these stories, in fact, all of these stories, aren't even that long. Some are actually even only a page long, but when the stories get going, I mean, they really get going and pack a lot within a mere couple of pages. And like I said, sometimes even just one page. And much of the stories are also based in urban legend, in folklore. And I've always been one who really loves folklore. I very much I've always enjoyed the old fairy tales, and some of those, one day I think I'll do a podcast on fairy tales perhaps, because those two are also, they can be quite gruesome as well. In fact, the original fairy tales were not the Disneyized version that we often get, but like I said, perhaps I will do an episode on the Brothers Grimm and maybe others like Hans Christian Andersen. But I've always very much been interested in fairy tales and folklore for about as long as I can remember. I also enjoy these stories still to this day is because the stories also, they tend to embrace the unknown and acknowledge that sometimes things don't always end happily. And I'm sure there might be some out there that might disagree with me on this, but I do feel that this can be quite an important lesson for kids to be taught. Not all of my stories end happily, and even those that do tend to have some sort of unresolved. I mean, at least for the most part. Then there's the unknown, which, you really don't know what's out there, or who the person sitting next to you on the bus or subway is, or the person passing by you on the street, as per the walk in the first Scary Stories book. And the man looked at my uncle, and my uncle looked at the man. The man was scared of my uncle, and my uncle was scared of that man. But they kept on walking, and deep into the woods they went. Yes, that is from The Walk, from the very first Scary Stories book. In fact, the more I think about it, the more I really can acknowledge how these stories have shaped my own writing and storytelling. In fact, some of my short stories, I have a short stories series out called Stories from Colony Drive, and it's actually named for the street that I grew up on. And this was the street on which my babysitter snuck up on me with one of Stephen Gammell's brilliant illustrations in front of her face. The stories definitely kept me up at night, I'm not going to lie about that, and I would sometimes lay in bed wondering if the creepy lady from the dream was going to come out of my closet. Yes, the creepy lady from the dream, in all of her stringy, long, dark-haired, and black, beady-eyed, and very, very just offsetting grin glory. And that's another story that is definitely on my list of my favorite stories from that collection. But all in all, what these stories also did was stir my imagination and really get me thinking outside the box and start to challenge myself as a writer. And not only a writer, but just as a creative in general from a very young age. It was the reason I actually began writing stories and wondering about the world around me. It was the beginning of me becoming someone who questions things and isn't afraid to. Now I look back on that fateful evening on Colony Drive with great fondness, and I am thankful to my babysitter for getting the idea to scare the ever-living crap out of me. And also, I definitely thank Alvin Schwartz and Stephen Gammell for awakening my and probably many others' imaginations. You guys just totally rocked that. I will also add that recently the Scary Stories trilogy inspired a movie called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and it was loosely based on many of these amazing stories, this compilation of stories. And I recently saw it. It was definitely on my list of movies to watch. And I have to say, I recommend it. It's a very, very fun, nostalgic film, especially for those of us that grew up with these stories. And like I said, they don't necessarily, it's loosely based on the stories. They don't necessarily follow the stories verbatim, but they do incorporate, I think, I like the way the film weaves the stories into the plot. In fact, I think it was kind of brilliant the way they did it. But I do recommend seeing the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark film. I believe it first came out last year, I want to say, and I've been wanting to see it, and I finally watched it as part of my Halloween movie list, and I'm glad I did. And on top of that, there is also a documentary put out too that I do recommend watching. It talks about the origins of the book, and Alvin Schwartz's son is actually interviewed in this documentary, and it also covers how these books were once put on the banned lists at schools, and so that was also interesting to see as well. I don't think that they should have been on the banned list personally, but apparently a lot of people think they did, and it's interesting to hear their sides of the story versus those who were very much against banning these books. And like I said, I'm glad that I got to experience these books as a child, and they really inspired me creatively. And also, like I said, just made me just think outside the box, and just even recognize that sometimes things don't always end happily. And personally, I think Alvin Schwartz was quite brilliant in putting these books together, and I think they shaped many of our childhood. So those are also two films based on the Scary Stories trilogies to check out. Like I said, it's the film is just called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and the documentary, I think, is called that too. It's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, a documentary. So yes, I definitely also recommend checking those out as well. And my favorite stories from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, the entire trilogy, it's really hard to say. I do like the haunted house. That one's a great, I think, a great story. In fact, I've woven that into my own historical storytelling as well. I do like The Walk. It's a very short story, almost kind of like a poem, but it's very unsettling, and then there's just no resolve at the end. The whole thing with the man looked at my uncle and my uncle looked at the man was scared of my uncle and my uncle was scared of that man, but they kept on walking into the woods. Also, Me, Ty Doty Walker, that one still kind of freaks me out to this day, if I'm being honest. I do like the story The Dream. I also like, of course, there's the Hearse song, Never Laugh as a Hearse Go By. For you may be the next to die, you know. Of course, there's that Hearse song, and oh gosh, there's just so many. But those are the ones that I can think of off the top of my head that I think are worth checking out. But the whole series is definitely worth checking out, whether it's for the first time or revisiting. All right, so now I would love to hear from you. What stories, if you grew up with the Scary Stories trilogy, which one was your favorite? And, you know, or if there was another book that perhaps had a huge impact on you as a child, gave you a nice little scare, which book was that? Because I know that there were a lot of books in the 80s and 90s, and, you know, that, you know, there was a lot of those out there, if I can recall. But which of the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark stories are your favorite? Or if you didn't grow up with those stories, what story was the first one that gave you a fright? I'd love to hear from you. And in fact, if it's maybe a book I hadn't heard of, I might check it out, and who knows, maybe I'll be including it on a future episode. So, all right, well, thank you so much for tuning into this Halloween episode of The Hidden Library. I am going to be bringing you more of these episodes in the coming months, especially since it is an old tradition to pretty much tell ghost stories during the holiday season, and not just at Halloween time. At Christmas, it's been an age-old tradition to tell ghost stories. So this isn't the last of the spooky Hidden Library episodes. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you in the next episode. Happy Halloween, blessed Samhain, and stay safe.